An obese 19-year-old was sold to Mountain Man as punishment by her father, but he had shocking plans. The morning frost clung to the windows of the general store like a desperate prayer when Clara's father dragged her through the wooden doors, his grip bruising her wrist. She kept her eyes down, as always, her rounded shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself smaller, an impossible task given her substantial frame. The store fell silent. Every conversation died mid-sentence as heads turned toward them. "I'm done with you," her father hissed, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "You're nothing but a burden, a waste of good food." Clara said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was safer than words. Her mother had died when Clara was 7, leaving her alone with a man who blamed his daughter for everything wrong in his miserable life. Too fat, too slow, too expensive to feed. The litany of her failures had become the soundtrack to her existence. Silas stood near the back of the store, a mountain of a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the peaks surrounding their valley. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with silver, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a memento from a bear that had thought him easy prey. He had come down from his cabin for winter supplies, something he did only twice a year, and the townsfolk gave him wide berth. Stories about him circulated like wildfire. Some said he had killed a man with his bare hands. Others whispered he had gone mad after losing his family to fever. No one knew the truth, and no one dared ask. Clara's father shoved her forward. "You need help up there on your mountain, don't you? I'll give you the girl. She's strong, stronger than she looks. Good for hauling water, chopping wood, whatever you need." He paused, then added with a cruel laugh, "She eats a lot, but I suppose you hunt enough to feed her." The humiliation burned through Clara like acid. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floorboards. Several people in the store snickered. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, looked away in disgust. Whether at Clara's father or at Clara herself, she couldn't tell. Silas studied them both with eyes the color of storm clouds. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder. "What do you want for her?" "A horse, a good one, and 3 bottles of your best whiskey." Clara's father's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Done." Silas pulled out a leather pouch and counted out the coins. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Clara became property, sold for less than a decent milk cow would fetch. As Silas led her out of the store, Clara's father called after them, "Don't bring her back. I'm done with her." The wagon ride up the mountain took 4 hours. Silas said nothing, his large hand steady on the reins. Clara sat as far from him as possible, clutching her threadbare shawl around her shoulders. The November wind bit through the thin fabric, but she didn't complain. She had learned not to ask for anything. The higher they climbed, the thicker the pine trees grew. Snow dusted the peaks above them, and the air grew thin and sharp. Clara's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Would he work her to death? Beat her? Use her and then discard her in the spring? She had heard stories about mountain men, about their isolation driving them to madness. When they finally arrived, twilight had painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The cabin was larger than Clara had expected, built from massive logs and nestled against a cliff face that provided natural protection from the wind. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. A small garden plot, now dormant for winter, lay to one side, and a sturdy barn housed Silas's animals. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his touch surprisingly gentle, and led her inside. The interior was sparse but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, already crackling with warmth. Rough-hewn furniture filled the space: a table, 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and what looked like a smaller sleeping pallet in another. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and thyme. Clara stood just inside the doorway, uncertain. Silas moved to the fireplace, and to her shock, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the bill of sale her father had signed, and tossed it into the flames. They watched together as it blackened and curled, turning to ash. "You're not my property," Silas said, his back still to her. "I bought you because I couldn't stomach watching your father sell you to someone who might actually hurt you." Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What?" He turned to face her then, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Sadness. Deep, bone-tired sadness. "The snow will fly soon. Bad snow. You'll have to stay the winter because the passes will close. But come spring, when the thaw comes, I'll take you to Grand Junction. You can start fresh there. Nobody knows you. Nobody will judge you." "I don't understand." Clara's hands trembled. "Why would you do that?" "Because somebody should have done it for me once." He moved past her to unload supplies from the wagon. "There's stew on the fire. Help yourself. The small bed in the corner is yours. I'll take the loft." That night, Clara lay awake on her pallet, which was surprisingly comfortable with thick blankets and a feather pillow. She listened to the wind howl outside and the sound of Silas's breathing from the loft above. For the first time in years, she went to sleep without her stomach cramping from hunger, and for the first time in forever, she wasn't afraid of the morning. The early winter days developed a strange rhythm. Silas woke before dawn to tend his animals and check his trap lines. Clara, uncertain of her place, began doing what she knew. She cleaned, she cooked, she organized. Silas never asked her to do these things, never demanded anything. But Clara needed to feel useful. She needed to prove she wasn't just a burden. She discovered that despite his fearsome appearance, Silas was remarkably gentle. He moved through the world with deliberate care, as if always conscious of his size and strength. When he spoke, which was rarely, his words were measured and kind. He never raised his voice. He never criticized. But Clara also noticed things he didn't say. She saw how he sometimes stared at the small wooden toys on the mantel, clearly made for children. She noticed the way his hands would tremble slightly when he held his coffee cup by the fire in the evenings. She saw the deep lines of grief carved into his face when he thought no one was watching. One afternoon, while Silas was out hunting, Clara found a small trunk pushed into a dark corner of the cabin. Curiosity overcame her, and she opened it. Inside were a woman's dress, carefully folded, 2 small shirts that would have fit boys around 5 and 7, and a tintype photograph of Silas, younger, smiling, with his arms around a beautiful woman and 2 young boys. They looked happy, whole. Clara closed the trunk quickly, guilt washing over her, but now she understood. Silas wasn't just a recluse by choice. He was a man haunted by ghosts. A week after her arrival, Clara noticed something. The chairs in the cabin were narrow, built for Silas's lean, muscular frame. When she sat in them, the wooden arms pressed uncomfortably against her hips, making her acutely aware of her size. She began sitting on the edge of her bed instead, or standing while she ate. Silas noticed. Of course he noticed. 3 days later, Clara woke to find something new beside the fireplace. A large rocking chair built from smooth pine with wide arms and a seat that could comfortably accommodate her. Thick furs lined the seat and back, making it look impossibly inviting. Silas was already outside doing his morning chores, saying nothing about the new addition. Clara approached the chair slowly, running her fingers over the armrest. The wood was still slightly damp with oil, freshly treated. She could see the marks where Silas had carefully sanded each surface until it was smooth. This hadn't been thrown together quickly. He had spent hours, maybe days, crafting it. She sat down carefully, and the chair embraced her. For the first time since she could remember, furniture didn't hurt. It didn't make her feel too big, too wrong. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. When Silas came in stamping snow from his boots an hour later, he found her still sitting there, staring into the fire. He glanced at the chair, then at her, then simply nodded and began preparing breakfast. No words were necessary. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher, Clara began to notice other small acts of care. Silas always gave her the best portions of meat at dinner, keeping the tougher, fattier pieces for himself. When she mentioned that her worn boots were letting in water, new ones appeared by her bed 3 days later, larger than standard women's sizes, clearly custom-made. When she caught a cold, Silas showed her his collection of herbs and taught her how to brew different teas. His hands, so large and rough, were surprisingly deft as he crushed leaves and measured portions. "My wife taught me," he said quietly one evening as they worked together. "She knew every plant on this mountain, could cure anything." His voice grew distant. "Everything except the fever that took her and my boys 8 years ago, come February." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "They got sick during a blizzard. I couldn't get down the mountain for a doctor. I just watched them slip away, one by one." He set down the mortar and pestle. "My youngest boy, Samuel, he was only 5. He kept asking why I couldn't fix it, why I couldn't make him better." Silas's voice cracked. "I've lived with that question every day since." Clara understood then. Silas hadn't run away to the mountains to escape the world. He had run to punish himself, to live in the place where he had failed his family, surrounded by memories, denying himself any comfort or connection. He had built a prison of solitude and called it home. "It wasn't your fault," Clara said softly. "I know that here." He tapped his head. "But not here." He touched his chest above his heart. In that moment, something shifted between them. They were both prisoners of their own stories, Clara trapped by her father's cruelty and society's judgment, Silas trapped by grief and guilt. The cabin suddenly felt less like a shelter and more like a shared sanctuary. Clara began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. She started lifting her head when she walked. She began speaking without being spoken to first, sharing observations about the weather or asking Silas about the animals. She experimented with the herbs and spices in his surprisingly well-stocked larder, transforming their simple meals into something more flavorful. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Silas asked one evening, after finishing a venison stew that Clara had seasoned with wild sage and juniper berries. "My mother," Clara said, a small smile touching her lips. "Before she died, she taught me. She said cooking was an art and that every meal was a gift." She paused. After she was gone, my father said I was just using it as an excuse to get fat, so I stopped trying. I just made basic things. Ate when he wasn't watching. He was wrong. Silas's voice was firm. This is more than food. It's care. You can taste it. Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest. Not embarrassment this time, but something else. Something like pride. She began exploring more of the cabin when Silas was out. She reorganized his medical supplies, grouping like items together. She mended his clothes, which were functional but often torn or missing buttons. She found an old spinning wheel in the barn and, using wool from Silas's small flock of sheep, began creating yarn. Silas noticed everything, though he rarely commented, but Clara could see his appreciation in small ways. The morning he came down from the loft wearing a shirt she had mended, all the buttons replaced. The way he carefully returned items to their newly organized places, the slight smile when he came home to dinner already prepared. It was late January when the storm hit. Silas had gone out to check his trap lines, something he did every 3 days. He left just after dawn, promising to be back by midday. But midday came and went. The sky darkened to a sickly yellow-gray, and the wind began to howl like a living thing. By early afternoon, snow was falling so thick that Clara couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. By evening, she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. And still, Silas hadn't returned. Clara tried to tell herself not to panic. He was experienced. He knew these mountains. He would find shelter and wait out the storm. But as the hours crept by and the temperature plummeted, her anxiety grew. She paced the cabin, starting at every sound, hoping to hear his footsteps on the porch. By midnight, she couldn't stand it any more. Clara bundled herself in every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped her head and face in thick wool, and took down Silas's spare lantern. She had watched him leave enough times to know the basic direction of his trap lines. She knew it was foolish. She knew she might get lost and die out there. But the thought of Silas alone, possibly injured, possibly dying, was worse than any fear for her own safety. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. The wind tore at her clothes, and the snow stung her exposed skin like needles. Clara tied a rope from the cabin door to the barn, then from the barn to the fence post, following the method she had seen Silas use. She would create a lifeline that she could follow back. Beyond the fence, she was in the wilderness. The snow was already knee-deep and getting deeper. Each step was a battle. Her legs, strong from a lifetime of carrying extra weight, pushed forward. Her lungs burned. Ice formed on her eyelashes, making it hard to see. But she kept going, calling Silas's name into the wind. She almost missed him. A dark shape against the white, partially covered in snow, huddled beneath a rocky outcrop. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her heart hammering. A massive fallen branch lay across his legs, and blood had frozen in dark streaks down his face. But he was breathing. Silas! She shook his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Clara? His voice was barely a whisper. You shouldn't. Too dangerous. Shut up, she said, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. I'm getting you home. She examined the branch. It was heavy, but not impossibly so. Clara braced herself, planted her feet, and lifted. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her back threatened to give out. But she thought about all those years of being told she was useless, being told her body was wrong, being told she was nothing but a burden. And she lifted harder. The branch shifted. Silas, working through the pain, managed to drag himself free. His right leg was badly bruised but not broken, by some miracle. Clara got her shoulder under his arm, taking most of his weight, and Silas was not a small man. But Clara wasn't small either, and for the first time in her life, she was grateful for every ounce of her strength. The journey back was a nightmare. Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Several times Clara thought she had lost the direction, that they would wander in circles until they both froze. But she pushed forward, using the rope she had tied as a guide once they found it, following it hand over hand through the blinding snow. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, both of them collapsed. Clara lay there for a long moment, unable to move, her entire body shaking with exhaustion. But Silas was still mumbling, still in danger. She forced herself to her feet. She dragged him to his bed, stripped off his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in every blanket she could find. She started a fire blazing in the hearth. She made hot tea and forced him to drink it. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on his head and the deep bruising on his leg. She worked through the night, checking his breathing, keeping him warm, monitoring for signs of frostbite. For 3 days, Silas burned with fever. In his delirium, he spoke to people who weren't there. "Emma, I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Boys, I tried so hard. I should have been faster, should have been smarter. It's my fault, all my fault." Clara sat beside him, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, speaking softly. "It's not your fault. You did everything you could. They knew you loved them. They knew." In his fevered dreams, Silas reached out, and Clara took his hand. His large fingers wrapped around hers, holding tight as if she were an anchor, keeping him from drowning. "Don't leave me in the cold," he whispered. "Please, don't leave me alone." "I won't," Clara promised. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." On the 4th day, the fever broke. Silas woke to find Clara asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her folded arms. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair tangled and her clothes rumpled. She had barely slept, barely eaten, spending every moment caring for him. "Clara," he said softly. She jerked awake, her eyes immediately going to his face. When she saw that his eyes were clear, that the fever had passed, relief washed over her features. "Thank God," she breathed. "You're back." "You saved my life," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "You came out in a blizzard and dragged me back. You could have died." "Yes," Clara said simply. "I could have. But I couldn't let you die out there alone. I couldn't lose you." Something passed between them then, an acknowledgment of a truth neither had been willing to speak. The storm raging outside had been matched by a storm inside each of them, and somehow they had weathered both. As Silas recovered over the following weeks, Clara cared for him with a devotion that surprised them both. She made him soup and bread. She helped him to the chair by the fire when he grew tired of bed. She changed his bandages with gentle efficiency, and slowly they began to really talk. Silas told her about Emma, about how they had met at a church social when he was 20, about his boys, Thomas, who loved to catch frogs, and Samuel, who could make anyone laugh, about building this cabin with his own hands, imagining a future of Christmases and birthdays, and growing old together. "After they died, I thought I died too," he admitted. "I went through the motions of living, but there was nothing inside, just emptiness." I stayed here because leaving felt like abandoning them. Like if I moved on, if I was happy again, it would mean they didn't matter. But that's not true, Clara said softly. Love doesn't work that way. Loving someone new doesn't erase the love you had before. Your heart is big enough for both. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw her fully for perhaps the first time, not just a girl he had rescued, not just a tragic figure, but a woman of incredible strength and courage, a woman with a generous spirit and a kind heart, a woman who, despite every cruelty life had thrown at her, had remained gentle. "Tell me about you," he said, "not just what your father did to you. Tell me who you are." It was harder for Clara to talk about herself. She had spent so long being told she was worthless that she struggled to find anything good to say. But Silas listened patiently, asking questions, encouraging her. Slowly, she began to remember the girl she had been before her father's cruelty had buried her. She talked about her mother, who had loved to sing while she worked, about the garden they had kept together, and how Clara had known the name of every flower, about books she had read as a child, borrowed from the traveling library, about dreams she had once had, before she learned to stop dreaming. "You're not what he said you were," Silas told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "You're brave and capable. You're intelligent and creative. You're beautiful." Clara flinched at the last word. "Don't say that. Don't lie to me." "I'm not lying." Silas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see the woman who walked into a blizzard to save my life. I see soft hands that can also be strong. I see gentle eyes that light up when you laugh. I see someone who makes this cold cabin feel like a home. That's beautiful, Clara. That's more beautiful than any china doll in a shop window." Clara felt tears spill over. She had never heard such words spoken to her, never imagined anyone could see her that way. "I don't know how to believe you." "Then let me show you," Silas said, "every day, until you see yourself the way I see you." As winter loosened its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, Clara felt a growing knot of anxiety. Spring meant the passes would open. Spring meant Silas would keep his promise to take her to Grand Junction to start a new life. Spring meant leaving. Silas had recovered fully, though he moved a bit more stiffly now in the cold mornings. The last of the snow was melting, creating rushing streams of ice-cold water down the mountainside. The animals were restless, sensing the change in seasons, and soon the route down would be clear. Clara tried to feel excited about her freedom, about the chance to start fresh somewhere no one knew her. But every time she thought about leaving the cabin, leaving the mountains, leaving Silas, her chest ached. This place had become more than a shelter. It had become home, and Silas had become more than her savior. He had become everything. But she said nothing. She had no right to ask him to let her stay. He had given her so much already. She couldn't burden him further with her feelings. Silas, for his part, grew quieter as spring approached. He had promised Clara her freedom, and he would honor that promise. But the thought of her leaving, of the cabin being empty again, of returning to his solitude, filled him with dread. For 8 years he had been alone, and he had believed he deserved that loneliness. But Clara had brought light back into his life. She had made him remember what it felt like to care for someone, to laugh, to hope. He loved her. He had fallen in love with her somewhere between that first night and the blizzard, between the shared meals and the quiet conversations. He loved her strength and her kindness, her resilience and her gentleness. He loved the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she talked to his animals, the way she had looked at him with such fierce determination when she dragged him out of the snow. But how could he ask her to stay? She deserved more than a grieving widower twice her age living in isolation on a mountain. She deserved a real life, with opportunities and friends and chances for happiness. The most loving thing he could do was let her go. The morning came when the eastern pass was finally clear. Silas had gone down to the lower trails and confirmed it. The way to Grand Junction was open. They could leave within the week. He returned to find Clara in the garden, preparing the soil for spring planting. She looked up when she heard him approach, and the hope in her eyes nearly broke him. "The pass is clear," he said quietly. "I'll take you down on Monday. That'll give us time to pack your things and—" "I don't want to go." The words hung between them, impossible to take back. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Clara," Silas began. "You promised me freedom," she interrupted. "Do you remember? You said come spring, you'd give me freedom to start a new life." "Yes, and I will. I'll give you enough money to—" "Silas, stop." Clara took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "You promised me freedom to choose my own life, to be who I want to be, to live how I want to live. So I'm choosing. I choose to stay here. I choose this cabin, this mountain. I choose you." Silas stared at her, barely daring to believe. "You don't know what you're saying. You'd be stuck here, isolated, with a broken old man." "You're not broken," Clara said fiercely. "You're healing. We both are. And I'm not stuck. I'm home. Don't you understand? For the first time in my life, I'm home. I wake up without fear. I go to sleep without shame. I look at myself through your eyes, and I see someone worthwhile, someone strong, someone who deserves to be happy." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the tears gathering in his eyes. "You gave me my freedom, Silas, and my freedom is choosing to love you. My freedom is choosing to build a life here with you, if you'll have me." Silas reached out with trembling hands and cupped her face. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I love every part of you, your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you make this cabin warm. I love the sound of your voice. I love you, Clara, and I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." When he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, filled with all the words they hadn't yet found. Clara wrapped her arms around him, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, this mountain of a man and this woman who had learned she was a mountain herself. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "I should probably ask you proper," Silas said. "Clara, will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me? Will you let me love you for as long as we both live?" "Yes," Clara said, joy flooding through her. "Yes to all of it. Yes to everything." They were married a month later, when the mountain was carpeted in wildflowers. The old circuit preacher who traveled through the territory performed the ceremony on the porch of their cabin with Silas's neighbors, a trapper and his Shoshone wife, who lived 15 miles south, as witnesses. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from cloth Silas had brought up from town. dyed a soft blue with indigo. She wove wild flowers into her hair, and when Silas saw her, he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The preacher spoke of love and commitment, of two souls finding each other against all odds. When it came time for vows, Silas spoke from his heart. "Clara, you saved my life twice, once when you pulled me from that storm, and once when you agreed to stay. You brought light back into my darkness. You made me believe I could be whole again. I promise to love you, to honor you, to see you as you truly are every single day. I promise to be worthy of the gift you've given me." Clara's voice shook with emotion as she responded, "Silas, you gave me the rarest gift anyone ever has. You gave me myself. You showed me I was strong when I thought I was weak. You showed me I was beautiful when I thought I was broken. I promise to love you fiercely, to stand beside you always, to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and celebrates our future." When the preacher pronounced them married, Silas kissed his wife with such tenderness that even the tough old trapper had to wipe his eyes. The celebration was simple: a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, music from the trapper's fiddle, laughter echoing off the mountain peaks. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Silas and Clara stood together on their porch, looking out over the valley. "Are you happy?" Silas asked softly. Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "More than I ever imagined possible." The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Clara sat in her rocking chair, the one Silas had made for her that first winter, nursing their newborn daughter. The baby was only 3 weeks old, her tiny fists waving in the air as she fed, her eyes squeezed shut in concentration. Silas knelt by the fireplace, carefully measuring coffee grounds, but his attention kept drifting to his wife and child. The wonder hadn't worn off yet. He wasn't sure it ever would. "She's going to be stubborn," Clara said, smiling down at the infant. "Look at how determined she is." "She gets that from her mother," Silas replied, bringing Clara a cup of tea. He kissed the top of her head, then gently stroked the baby's dark hair. Strong like her mother, too. They had named her Emma Rose, honoring both of Silas's late wife and Clara's mother. At first, Clara had worried it might be painful for Silas, but he had insisted. "Love doesn't replace love," he had said, echoing Clara's words from years before. "It adds to it. Emma would have loved you. She would have loved our daughter. This way, they're all connected." The cabin had changed over the past 2 years. It was larger now. Silas had added a new room for the baby, with a beautiful hand-carved crib. The garden had expanded significantly under Clara's care, providing vegetables they sold at the trading post. Clara had also become known for her herbal remedies, with people traveling from miles around to buy her salves and tinctures. But more than the physical changes, the cabin felt alive. Where once it had been a tomb of memories, now it rang with laughter and conversation. Where once Silas had moved through it like a ghost, now he lived fully in each moment. Where once Clara had made herself small and invisible, now she took up space with confidence and joy. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked softly. "Staying here instead of going to town? You could have had so much more. Friends, society, opportunities." Clara looked up at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I have everything I need. I have you. I have our daughter. I have this mountain and this life we've built together. I have myself, Silas, the self I lost and found again. How could I regret any of that? The baby finished nursing and let out a satisfied sigh. Clara lifted her to her shoulder, patting her tiny back gently. Silas reached out, and Clara carefully transferred their daughter to his massive arms. The contrast was almost comical, this enormous scarred mountain man holding an infant so tiny and delicate. But his touch was infinitely gentle, his expression soft with love. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "Welcome to another beautiful day." As if in response, Emma Rose opened her eyes, gray like her father's, bright and curious. She looked up at Silas with an expression of complete trust, and he felt his heart expand in his chest. He had been given a second chance at happiness, at family, at love, and he would spend every day of the rest of his life being worthy of that gift. Clara watched them, her heart full to bursting. She thought about the terrified, broken girl who had been sold like livestock 2 years ago. She thought about the long journey from shame to self-acceptance, from fear to love. She thought about Silas's patient devotion, his unwavering belief in her worth, his gentle guidance as she learned to see herself through new eyes. Outside, spring was in full bloom. The mountain meadows were carpeted with wildflowers, and the streams ran clear and cold with snowmelt. Birds sang in the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled. Life was returning, renewing, continuing its eternal cycle. Inside the cabin, a new family had been forged, not from the ashes of the old, but growing alongside it, honoring the past while celebrating the present. Two broken people had found each other and, in the finding, had become whole. Emma Rose yawned, her tiny pink mouth opening wide, and both her parents laughed. It was a sound that echoed off the cabin walls, joyful, complete. "Home, I love you," Clara said softly, looking at her husband and daughter. "Both of you, more than words can say." Silas met her eyes, his own shining with emotion. "And we love you, forever and always." Outside, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging, but inside the small cabin nestled against its slope, everything had changed. Where there had been sorrow, now there was joy. Where there had been isolation, now there was family. Where there had been two people convinced they were unworthy of love, now there was a love so deep and true it transformed everything it touched. And high on the mountain, in a cabin built by a grieving man's hands and warmed by a brave woman's heart, a new story continued to unfold, one of healing, hope, and the extraordinary power of love to redeem even the most broken of souls.